Okay, today we are moving into the later Middle Ages, which we're going to say from about the year 800 till about the year 1200. Again, you know, some of those dates are flexible and fluid, but roughly that's the period that we're talking about for the next couple weeks. So I want to say that overall the exams looked good. I have graded the ones that were submitted, returned them back to you. You should be able to pull them up in Blackboard. You received the pictures. I sent you an email saying I did, so you should have that, and so I was able to. I'm sorry that some of you did run into troubles with Blackboard, but fortunately everybody was able to get that information into me. So that is, I don't know, it seems like something is going on with Blackboard this semester. It just doesn't want to seem to cooperate, which of course if you're taking an online class makes it very difficult since you're kind of really bound by having to use Blackboard. But overall, the exams, many of you improved from the first exam, so that was good. So I would encourage you to continue to keep that good work up. Don't forget the next primary source essay is due on Friday. So that's number 4. Remember, you only have to do 5, but you can do that 6th one. So if you haven't done some along the way, I would encourage you to make sure to do this one. But you know, just kind of keep that in mind. So let's get into now the later medieval period. The period now getting changing in some ways related to politics, where in the West we've kind of seen some things beginning to split apart. Now we're seeing things pulling back together, and in the East that was relatively together is going to start pulling apart, largely because of the presence of Muslims and encroaching Islamic power. Let's start off, though, in the West and kind of end up where we had left off when we talked about politics last time with the reign of Charlemagne. So on Christmas Day in the year 800, Pope Leo III crowned the Frankish leader known as Charles the Great, or Charlemagne, as emperor. Now, there had been quite a bit of tension between Leo and Charlemagne. Leo had been accused of adultery, fornication, a variety of other things as well, which is one of the standards throughout the later medieval period, is that the papacy, which has become so powerful, now becomes a prize to be sought after, and a wide variety of individuals, not always of upstanding moral character, will ascend to the papacy, but we'll talk about that later on. At the time, there was a vacuum of power going on in the eastern part of the empire. This is pretty much where we left off when we talk about the iconoclast controversy. We're talking about that period where Irene is in charge. And her husband had died, and so she had come to power. But she cannot technically be considered empress because she's a woman, and so she cannot technically rule. And her son is too young to be emperor. Now, here in the West, though, is Charlemagne being crowned emperor. So a lot of the people in the East are looking at this very negatively. It seems like the Pope and Western Frankish rulers are trying to kind of usurp authority that had belonged in the East. There are even rumors that circulate that Irene is considering marriage with Charlemagne, and so trying to reunify some things. Eventually, though, the emperors in the East, as they would continue to develop, would recognize Charlemagne's authority in the Western lands. Although Charlemagne sees himself as Constantine, right? He wants to be Roman emperor again, right, over all of it. Now, with the crowning of Charlemagne as emperor, which there hadn't been an emperor in the West since 476, it suggested some things to people about what was going on. First of all, they saw it as a continuation of the Roman Empire that for a long time had not been around. It suggested unity in Western Christianity. It suggested the rejection of the authority of the Eastern Emperor, but for some people as well, it also suggested the superiority of popes over kings, since it was the Pope who had crowned Charlemagne as emperor. Something that Charlemagne himself was not particularly fond of, but something that he did allow to take place. Many people referred to his rule or thought of him like David or Josiah. Here was a king with a religious right to govern. And not only is he anointed as king, but there's also a belief that perhaps he has some religious responsibilities as well. And Charlemagne himself also thought of that. Felt that he could appoint bishops. He would legislate that preaching should be done in native languages. But he also legislated what he thought should be preached. And so he sees himself not just as a political ruler, but a religious ruler as well. Sunday, legally recognized as a day of worship, and so there were restrictions of what could be done on Sundays. He would collect tithes, or the offerings of people, like taxes, and also emphasize the importance of clerical celibacy, that the clergy should remain celibate. He controlled most of the West, except that area was controlled by Muslims, which is largely Spain at this time in Europe, as well as the British Isles. After his death, however, his empire, for what it was worth, began to deteriorate as well. His son, Louis the Pious, succeeds him, becomes Frankish king after that. Charlemagne had encouraged Louis to crown himself instead of allowing the Pope to do it. Louis, of course, by being nicknamed the Pious, of course, suggested that he was rather religious. But he did crown himself, but then later allowed the Pope to crown him as well. He too engaged in a wide variety of this combination between politics and religion, tried to encourage reform in monasteries. The monasteries were expected to follow the rule of Benedict. Eventually his son Lothair would become co-emperor and would make an agreement with the Pope, Eugene II at the time, over what relationships between the Pope and the Emperor would look like. According to this relationship, the Emperor had supreme jurisdiction. The Pope had political power over the Papal States, where he could act as a judge and administrator. There were even guidelines developed how a Pope was to be elected. And so this is the political realm trying to shape how the religious realm is going to go. But church property was not to be plundered on the death of the Pope, so some restrictions there. The Emperor had to confirm, however, the election of the Pope, meaning that he could be elected, but it would be the Emperor who made the final decision whether that person would reign as Pope or not. In fact, the Pope was expected to take a loyalty oath to the Emperor. On the other hand, it was conceded that the Pope crowned and anointed the Emperor. Louis was overall good-natured, which led many people, including bishops, to take advantage of this. The latter part of his reign, however, was marked by civil war. Some from his sons, including Lothair, Louis the German, Pippin, and Charles the Bald. I am not making any of those names up, I promise you. What often would happen, though, is when he would defeat these groups, he would forgive them, and then they would later down the line rebel again. After his death, his sons would ultimately divide the empire into several different regions. His grandson, Charles the Fat, not to be confused with Charles the Bald, became emperor toward the end of the 9th century, where he reunited the empire. So even though Charlemagne is crowned emperor is not a continual line because it's breaking up and being reunited. And after Charles the Fat died, the empire broke up again. So it's not a continual empire. Additionally, in these later years of the Middle Ages, there were continued invasions. This time, though, by a group of people from other places, particularly Norsemen or Scandinavians. They were Germanic peoples as well that had moved to Scandinavia and had invaded from the extreme northern Europe. Eventually, they developed shipbuilding which allowed them to travel and attack more regions. We're talking here, of course, about the Vikings. And so they, who were largely pagan, invaded Ireland in the 8th century, ravaged the monasteries there, eventually attacked the coasts of France, where they would sack churches and monasteries, and then would return with property and slaves. They were seen as the enemies of God because the places they're attacking include churches and monasteries. Eventually, a group of them would settle in France in a region that would be later called Normandy, and they would become known as Normans. Gradually, though, they became Christian through taking the faith of those they conquered, kind of thinking, we're going to absorb their culture. And so eventually a lot of these were converted into Christianity. And often it was the case that we've seen before, right? A leader gets converted and then coerces the rest of their people to get converted as well. Another group invading around this same time are the Hungarians. They are originally known as Magyars, but they are reminiscent of the Huns from the 4th, 5th century, 6th century, and so they become referred to as Hungarians. They would repeatedly invade Germany, eventually getting into southern Italy. Their conversion took place through missionary activity. Late in the 10th century, their king was baptized. The next king after him then forced the people to convert as well. In the early 10th century, the empire moved from being controlled by the Franks to being controlled by the Saxons. Essentially, the death of Charles the Fat relatively, ended this revived Roman Empire and would dissolve into a variety of territories which were ruled by various kings. The last Carolingian king, this is the line of Charles, was Louis the Lazy, I'm not making this up, who died childless. Meanwhile, in Germany, the rulers of a region known as Saxony began to rise in prominence. Henry the Fowler, Fowler as in he used falcons and like hunting with falcons, not Fowler as in horrible person, was elected king of Germany in 919 and became the first Saxon king over the region. He makes plans for his son Otto to succeed him, which he does in 936 after Henry dies from a stroke. Not everybody is happy with this arrangement, including Otto's brother. So there's revolt, rebellion at Henry's death, but Otto eventually continues to consolidate power. Part of that includes using the church as a means to hold on to his power, claiming that he had a divine right to rule, which also extended then to his claims that he should be allowed to appoint bishops, other church leaders. Again, this power struggle over who is the supreme authority in the land. Is it the religious authority or the political authority? He would give power to church officials, which sounds like it was pretty magnanimous. He's giving authority to the religious sphere. Well, basically, he gave the power to them in order to take it from secular rulers he thought were going to be a problem for him. And so in order to kind of keep them in control, he took some of their power, gave it to the bishops, which also then tied the bishops to Otto as well, because he's the one that gave them their power. Eventually he would begin to extend his control into places like Italy. Largely these are places that are undergoing turmoil at this time in this 10th century, and so this is a way for him to extend his power, provide stability. As the Hungarians began their invasion, there is some success that they have during civil wars and rebellions. But as those are ended and the Hungarians try again, Otto is more successful, eventually kicking the Hungarians out. He would arrange for the Pope, John XII at the time, to crown him as emperor in 962. He is crowned as emperor over the kingdom of Italy and the kingdom of Germany in what will later be known as the Holy Roman Empire.